At times, it seems that in some cases, law enforcement officials deliberately avoid combating criminals. Negligence in such matters can have such serious consequences that one involuntarily wonders whether the actions of law enforcement officers are even more severe than the crime committed by the caught perpetrator. On May 7, 1998, around 2 a.m., a man called the 911 emergency service. He reported hearing cries for help coming from the apartment of his neighbor, Shannon Schieber, in their apartment building located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA. Immediately after hearing these pleas, the man went upstairs and knocked on the girl's apartment door. Suspicious sounds could still be heard from inside, but no one answered or opened the door. Therefore, he decided to immediately contact the rescue service. Realizing the critical nature of the situation, the man also turned to another neighbor who lived on the floor below. He hoped that together they would be able to break down the door and come to the girl's aid. Unfortunately, this resident of the building was away on business in another city, and his wife could not help. The man returned to Shannon's apartment door and anxiously awaited the arrival of the police. It seemed that the noise inside had completely subsided, and the knocking on the door continued to be ignored. Law enforcement officers arrived at the scene 7 minutes later. The apartment of the story's heroine was quiet. The police initially intended to simply leave, as they saw no grounds for breaking down the door. However, the woman's neighbors from the lower floor confirmed that they had heard suspicious sounds resembling a struggle and insisted on a thorough check. The officers went outside and illuminated the balcony with flashlights but did not notice anything suspicious there either. The doors were closed, and something was blocking the view from the inside. The authorities refused to break into someone else's apartment and advised the neighbors to call the rescue service again if the alarming sounds were repeated. After 5 minutes in a cursory inspection, the officers left. They heard no more noise from the girl's apartment. That evening, Shannon Schieber was supposed to be preparing for an important exam. She was completing her first year of a finance program and planned to meet with a research group at 9 a.m. It was expected that after a successful defense, Shannon and her brother Sean would go to a restaurant to celebrate the event. The young man was also going to attend the defense to support his sister. The story's heroine hoped to pass the exam, celebrate the victory, and go home to Maryland with her brother to see their parents. But when the young man arrived at the meeting, it turned out that his sister had not shown up for the defense. He could not wait for her, although it was a very important event for Shannon, which she could not simply ignore. The worried young man decided to go to his sister's home after the meeting to find out what had happened. There, he immediately noticed that the balcony doors were open, despite the curtains being drawn. When Sean knocked and rang the doorbell, no one responded. Then he went to his girlfriend Samantha to contact his mother. After telling the woman about the situation, he heard her request to return to the apartment complex and find someone who had the keys. The male neighbor who had called the police at night, hearing some commotion near Shannon's door, came out to find out what was going on. Shannon's brother informed him that his sister had not shown up for an important meeting, which was very uncharacteristic of her. The man instantly recalled the events of the previous night and told about them. He had still not been able to convince the police to break down the door to help the neighbor. Upon hearing this news, the brother was horrified. He broke down the door himself and found his 23-year-old sister lifeless. She was lying face down, covered with a sheet and completely undressed. Shannon had been killed. Seeing this horrific scene, the young man immediately fainted. Sean's girlfriend called the parents and told them about the tragedy. The entire family was stunned and shocked by this news. Shannon Schieber was an extremely gifted child, and her talent was evident from the earliest years. At the age of 1.5, she already knew the alphabet, even in reverse order. At the age of 3, the girl could read at a second-grade level. She always stood out for her brightness, curiosity, and thirst for development and knowledge of the world. So it's not surprising that Shannon became one of the best students in school and even spoke before the city council. Shannon repeatedly presented her reports at various conferences, mostly devoted to financial topics that greatly interested her. The girl dreamed of building a career in this field. Her remarkable talent was noticed at an early age. Shannon even met with U.S. President George Bush when he was seeking re-election. Naturally, Shannon effortlessly entered the university, where she also became the best among the freshmen. And a little later, she headed the university equestrian team, as horse riding was one of her hobbies. 3 years later, the girl graduated from the higher educational institution, having obtained a degree in economics, philosophy, and mathematics. At the age of 22, Shannon received a full-due degree from the prestigious Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. During this period, she made every effort to build a career in the financial sector. At the same time, the girl actively helped other students who had difficulties understanding certain topics. Then she moved to Philadelphia. Her father personally helped her find a suitable apartment in the city that would be comfortable and as safe as possible. They were offered a neighborhood in the center, where several student campuses were located. It was considered the safest in the city. After moving, Shannon actively prepared for the exams. However, her peaceful life was disrupted quite quickly. From the beginning of May 1997, the girl repeatedly complained that some suspicious man was following her. She was afraid of the stalker and deliberately took a longer route home, hoping that he would lose track of her and not find out where her apartment was located. Shannon had no idea that a serial and brutal killer targeting young female students was at large. The attack on Shannon occurred even before her murder. On June 20, 1997, an unknown assailant broke into her apartment through a window and attacked the girl. Pinning the story's heroine to the bed, he tried to. However, Shannon managed to convince the attacker to abandon his intentions. The criminal simply left, and the girl turned to the police. She even provided the detectives with several strands of the perpetrator's hair. However, law enforcement officers were skeptical about this. For the next year and a half, no one even analyzed these hairs. Less than a month later, Shannon was attacked again. On July 11, 1997, having returned home from a walk with friends around 9:30 p.m., she woke up already undressed. The girl's head and neck ached, and her hair was wet. On Shannon's throat, she found bruises resembling strangulation marks, and her eyes had ruptured blood vessels. The girl turned to the police again, but even after the second statement, the officers treated it negligently. They decided that it was just a burglary that was not worth their attention. On August 6, 1997, the police department received a statement from another victim who lived near Shannon in a neighboring building. The woman said that while she was sleeping, a stranger broke into her apartment. He threw a pillowcase over her face, tightened a belt around her neck, and fled. The girl was lucky that the belt was not tightened too much, and she did not suffocate. She was also able to provide the police with the biological material. It was analyzed, but no connection was established with the previous attacks in the city. The next attack occurred on August 13, 1997. A girl from the same neighborhood, waking up at night, saw an unknown man standing in the darkness in her bedroom. He covered her mouth and began to strangle her, just like the previous victims. The criminal's goal was again. Law enforcement officers managed to obtain the attacker's biological material from the victim. And only then did they finally establish a connection with the attack that occurred on August 6 of the same year. Eventually, the city police department took seriously the theory that a serial was operating in the neighborhood where Shannon lived. In August 1998, the investigation into her murder gained momentum. Detectives pieced together the events of that fateful night. It turned out that on the night of the crime, the girl, having returned home, was going to take a bath. She did not expect a new attack, as she knew how the criminal had entered her apartment the first time. A tree grew near Shannon's balcony, which could be used to reach her home. But after the previous incident, the girl had wrapped the branches with barbed wire, believing that she was now safe. Unfortunately, Shannon did not take into account a small area through which it was still possible to reach the balcony doors. It only required a little swinging. Apparently, the criminal turned out to be sufficiently determined and trained to do this, despite the risk of falling. In addition, the girl made a fatal mistake: she did not close the balcony doors to ventilate the apartment while taking a shower. When the attacker pounced on Shannon, a struggle ensued. The books she was reading in preparation for the upcoming exam were scattered on the floor. Traces of blood were found on the walls of the bedroom, balcony, and bed. The police had to analyze the evidence found to determine whether it belonged to the criminal or the victim. In addition to murder, the scoundrel also stole several of Shannon's belongings, including an expensive camera, a pen, and some jewelry. Therefore, the investigators considered versions of theft and even voluntary departure from life, anything to avoid acknowledging the obvious. Shannon's parents were the first to arrive at the department for questioning. They came to their daughter's apartment about 19 hours after the body was discovered. The girl's relatives were very depressed, including because the journalists who met them near the house asked the most unpleasant questions without ceremony. The reporters' cynicism only intensified the difficulty of the moment, but this was just the beginning. Then there were difficulties with the identification and transfer of the body. The parents could not pick it up right away until they began to appeal to higher authorities. Bureaucratic obstacles and weekends interfered. During this period, Shannon's relatives actively posted flyers around the city to draw public attention to what had happened. The police continued to work and came across one of Shannon's classmates from Wharton. However, he was immediately excluded from the list of suspects after the first interrogation, as the DNA samples did not match. Now law enforcement officers believed that the attack was committed by someone close to the girl and suspected one of her ex-boyfriends. But Shannon was completely absorbed in her studies and career and had no experience with men. These versions did not provide any leads. By the end of the same year, Shannon's name was mentioned 3 times in the lists of America's most wanted criminals. However, the case was at a standstill until an important call came to the department. Finally, in the fall, an anonymous source contacted the police, drawing attention to the fact that the detectives had ignored the obvious connection between Shannon's death and a series of in the area. Although this may seem absurd, even after that, the obvious was again left out of the investigation's attention. In January 1999, investigators finally doubted their conclusions. They decided to test the theory that all these crimes were committed by the same person. Until that time, it was not possible to compare DNA samples, as the testing information was stored on different computers that were incompatible with each other. The hype surrounding this case attracted the attention of journalists. It was during this period that police officers began to compare evidence from a whole series of attacks. The investigation was moving too slowly. So much so that a group of enthusiasts appeared who decided to independently analyze the data that was in the public domain. Suddenly, several journalists managed to find out that there was an unspoken rule in the city according to which statements from victims were simply ignored. The department that was supposed to fight such crimes always openly accused the girls of lying. Cases of violence remained unsolved. This concerned at least half of the appeals. The rest were not taken into account at all, and after 5 years, according to state laws, these cases were written off due to the statute of limitations. Of course, law enforcement agencies strongly denied such assumptions. However, 2 years after the start of a whole series of investigations, the authorities admitted that these were not isolated cases of negligence, but a systematic violation. There was systemic negligence, as many were committed over 17 months, in each of which DNA samples were provided, which, as it later turned out, matched. And only the unspoken rules in the Department for Investigating based crimes prevented this from being established immediately. As journalists who conducted an independent investigation managed to find out, over the past 5 years, out of more than 800, less than 200 were solved. The rest were simply closed due to the expiration of the statute of limitations. Ignoring this situation led to the fact that crimes were not recorded. The area where Shannon moved was considered safe, although in reality, regular attacks on girls took place there. As the father of the deceased noted, he would never have allowed his daughter to settle there if he had known about it. It took law enforcement officers 8 months to link 5 committed in virtually neighboring houses by the same person. It turned out that they could even have a composite sketch of the criminal, as one of the victims described him in detail. When all these materials were gathered together, it finally became possible to see the obvious. A reward of $40,000 was immediately announced for any information that would help catch the serial killer. In July 1999, FBI profilers joined in compiling a psychological portrait of this criminal. They assumed that it could be a fit and agile young man with good physical shape, possibly an athlete or military man who had a tendency to. He liked to peep at women, so he was even given the code name Bourbon from the center. 15 months after the murder of Shannon Schieber, the serial criminal struck again. He unscrewed 14 screws on the window grate to penetrate the apartment of the next victim. Now another FBI agent who specialized in the geographical profiling of criminals was involved in the investigation. That is, he compared and analyzed information about the victims' places of residence and the location of the crime scenes. Suddenly, the attack stopped, and it seemed that the criminal had gone to ground. However, 2 years later, they resumed, but hundreds of kilometers away from the city. Now attacks with a similar modus operandi began to occur in Fort Collins, Colorado. Of course, at first, no one suspected that this could be related to the series of attacks in Philadelphia. On May 10, 2001, another victim woke up in her own apartment and saw an unknown young man next to her. He immediately attacked her, covered her eyes, and committed violence. During the week, another similar attack occurred on the same street against a woman whose husband was dying of cancer, and her son had just gone on a hike. She had previously been working at a computer and suddenly heard a suspicious noise. She did not even have time to turn around as the criminal immediately pounced on her, covered her eyes, and said that he would not harm her if she did not resist. The woman had to obey. The rapist assaulted her in the same way and fled. Throughout the year, similar incidents were repeated in Fort Collins. The serial criminal left many fingerprints there, traces of biological material with his DNA, and he was even seen when he was fleeing in a car after one of the crimes. All this information was sent to police departments throughout the United States. This is how it was possible to establish a connection between these attacks and those that occurred in the area where Shannon lived. The police were able to find out that all this was the work of one person. The situation was extremely serious, as there was no one similar to the criminal in the database. Therefore, it was planned to identify and stop this scoundrel, who terrorized at least 2 states, by any means necessary. A list was compiled of persons who had cases of assaults in both states, as well as those who fit the description of the criminal's appearance and psychological profile. In total, the list included more than 800 people. Unfortunately, the detectives did not have time to check them all before new attacks occurred. Incidents with a similar modus operandi continued. In September 2001, the Colorado police received a letter from an anonymous sender. It turned out to be the serial they were actively searching for. He mocked the detectives, claiming that they would not be able to stop him because he had changed his place of residence again. It quickly became clear that this was just a ploy, as there were no fingerprints on the letter. The criminal was simply trying to slow down the investigation. Meanwhile, the police had to act quickly, as according to Pennsylvania laws, if a crime was not solved within 5 years, the case would be closed due to the statute of limitations. Law enforcement officers checked all available leads, which amounted to about 1,000 statements from various people. One of them came from a woman who said that she had dated a guy who looked like the composite sketch. His name was Troy Graves. Another tip was given by a woman who pointed to the car used by the She lived next door to a young military man who had exactly the same car. The owner of this vehicle also turned out to be Troy Graves. He was even on the list of 800 people previously compiled by the police. The coincidences could not be accidental. Troy was a member of the military. He joined the armed forces in 1999 and underwent basic training at an Air Force base in Texas. Then he studied at a missile maintenance school in California. But just a month after another transfer, he received a severe reprimand for trying to break into the apartment of a female Air Force captain who was in the dormitory at night. Even then, it turned out that he had a propensity for violence, but this incident was not given due attention. Troy's ex-girlfriend shared that he often went for night walks, explaining it by problems with sleep. When he returned, fresh scratches and bruises could often be seen on his face and hands. The girl tried to demand explanations from him about this, but he could not provide them. Each time, Troy made up different stories, and only later did she realize what was really happening. Thanks to the fact that Troy served in the armed forces, it was possible to find out his blood type, which matched the DNA samples found at the crime scenes. Of course, this was not enough, so a full data check was necessary. When the police visited Troy's home, they found only his wife there. At that time, he had already been in an official relationship for about a year. The woman could not provide any valuable information and did not notice anything suspicious but promised to tell her husband to contact law enforcement. Troy agreed to voluntarily come in for questioning. There, his fingerprints and DNA samples were taken. The young military man reluctantly cooperated, so a warrant had to be obtained. The suspect's behavior became understandable, as the materials matched those collected during the investigation of crimes in Colorado. On April 23, 2002, 29-year-old Air Force Senior Lieutenant Troy Graves was arrested on suspicion of 6 assaults in Colorado. The man was charged with an additional 27 counts, including robbery, abduction, and violence. Many other charges were brought in Philadelphia. As it turned out, the daughter of Troy's ex-girlfriend recognized him on the wanted posters hung around the city. The Philadelphia police had even detained him for questioning back in 1999 but released him almost immediately for unknown reasons. While the issue of the venue for the first series of court hearings was being resolved, Troy pleaded guilty to the murder and Shannon Schieber to avoid the death penalty. He said that he had entered the girl's apartment through the balcony doors and caught her by surprise in the bathroom. However, she began to resist and managed to bite his finger hard, which is why traces of the attacker's blood were left in the apartment. The suspect explained that he had no intention of killing the girl, it happened by accident. Trying to subdue the victim and immobilize her for he began to strangle Shannon. However, he miscalculated his strength and heard a terrible crunch. The criminal decided that he had broken her neck. He also admitted that he heard the neighbors trying to break down the door, so he became quiet. The circumstances were such that Troy was in the apartment just at the moment and the police arrived there in response to the call. If the officers had not refused to break down the door at the neighbor's request, they would have caught the criminal right at the murder scene. The prosecutor tried to refute these conclusions. He believed that the victim's brother himself opened the balcony doors when he saw his sister dead on the bed. But the young man denied these statements, as he had noticed from the street that the balcony doors were open. His girlfriend confirmed these words. When the police arrived at the call, they shone flashlights on the balcony doors, which, according to them, were closed. This supported the theory that the authorities had shown criminal negligence, which cost Shannon her life. The issue of the death penalty was actively discussed. However, the parents of the deceased girl were against it, as they turned out to be convinced Catholics. In fact, Shannon's family strongly opposed such punishment. They even communicated with other victims about this. All of them supported their position, and Troy's lawyer personally thanked them for this initiative. However, there were still many people who believed that the criminal deserved to die for his terrible deeds, including high-ranking officials who closely followed the development of events. But instead of seeking the death sentence for Troy, Shannon's parents decided to sue the Philadelphia police, accusing them of negligence. The federal lawsuit stated that the unspoken rule followed by employees of the local law enforcement department led not only to Shannon's death but also to the dozens of other victims who received psychological trauma. However, the deputy prosecutor insisted that the police officers acted correctly and even called them professionals. Of course, he was simply trying to keep his position and avoid the development of events that could lead to the prosecution of police officers. Despite the active efforts of the murdered girl's parents, the case was simply closed. On May 17, 2002, Troy Graves was sentenced to life imprisonment in Fort Collins, Colorado. During the trial in Philadelphia, he pleaded guilty to 6 counts of rape, as well as to the murder of Shannon. As a result, Troy was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. In addition, he received an additional 250 years in prison for numerous rapes. After the verdicts were passed, Shannon's parents continued to insist on the need to reform the system. Since it was not possible to punish the police officers who were guilty of negligence, the couple decided to change the system as a whole. They proposed creating a supervisory committee that could independently monitor the progress of investigations into crimes. Even a superficial acquaintance with the work of law enforcement agencies revealed a huge number of violations related to both the classification of crimes and the investigation process itself. Ultimately, the proposed reform was implemented, and it was even adopted by other states. It is still in effect today. In 2016, the Victims Assistance Center launched 12 pilot programs aimed at improving the work of the justice system in the United States. Shannon's parents also continued to fight against the use of the death penalty. However, this issue still causes significant differences in society. Many Americans believe that murderers should be executed. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.